Hi, I'm Gaurangi. All the best for the debate.
Hi guys, my name is Shivani. I'll be going as panel for today's debate, gender background, she, her. All the best.
Great. Before we begin, couple of housekeeping rules. Nothing you say after 7 minutes 15 seconds would be noted down. POIs are highly encouraged. And since this is an online debate, POI preferences with regards to like how you want POIs to be asked are enforceable, i.e., either via chat, by raise of hand, or like by unmuting. With that, Prime Minister, here yours.
Cool. Hi guys. My name is Joseph. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, both.
Cool. Let me just set up my timer really quickly. Okay. Okay. Let's try this out. All right. Okay. POI preference is via the chat, the debate channel chat, the one where we were putting all our stuff earlier. Yeah, I'll for sure take one. No preferred pronouns. We'll do a countdown before I begin my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, in Indian Tier 1 cities, we ultimately see a rising cost and over congestion because of the forces of supply and demand, given people wanting to be able to study and work there. But this is also amidst the backdrop of inflation, wherein property prices, in order to be able to own things and even rent, significantly increase. I'm referring to tier 1 cities like that of Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, and Chennai. As a consequence, it's very difficult for the working class and even millennials to be able to afford real estate. And as a consequence, they end up just renting. But also within that renting market, we also see an increased cost in rent because of many people trying to be able to go there. And as a consequence, on both sides of this debate, yes, you can rent, but we want to be able to empower and give people more options. So, developers, because they of course make more money in terms of a single instance with build to sell, it's quite hard for people to find affordable rental options. This is also true for tier 2 cities like Kochi, Jaipur, and Indore, which have emerging but still nascent infrastructure amidst this not yet being a fully established CBD or central business district. As a consequence, people wanting to go there are excited for opportunity, but they also don't want to fully commit, right? Like they rather rent in these cities. They don't want to be burdened to fully commit to have to be able to buy there. They want flexibility because they might live in a tier 1 city but work in a tier 2, or they might live in a tier 2 city but um work also in another tier 2 city, or even stay in a tier 1 because of their circumstances. This debate is a policy debate about what model is best so that the average Indian person and people coming there will be able to find an affordable place to live, and what lens the Indian government should use as an economic strategy to be able to push and incentivize developers. Huge developers like DLF, Godrej, or Macrotech with the Lodha Group. A couple of features of our model we want to clarify, which also serve as substantive material. Number one, what do we mean by actively incentivize? Let's talk about actively incentivizing on the developer side, because local and national government are going to do that incentivizing. We're talking about economic levies like that of subsidies and tax breaks in order to incentivize them to have more build to rent options, as opposed to skewing their portfolio to build to sell, where you force the hand of people, even if it's marginally cheaper, to have to lock into that contract to be able to buy that property. Because it's not about a debate of, oh, what's better, build to sell or build to rent? Because, guys, these property developers have both of these under their portfolio. It's a matter of trying to understand what strategy should the Indian government do to be able to skew the construction of that portfolio moving forward amidst the problem I said in my pre-oration about tier 1 cities being overly congested and tier 2 cities being emerging but at the same time not being something people fully want to commit to yet. Let's talk about the people side, right? We want to be able to push those like middle class people and those who can afford it, particularly those who might also be on the verge of becoming below the poverty line, to be able to be renting as opposed to being forced to have to be able to buy because it's expensive. Opposition might be like, yeah, Joseph, brah, build and sell. If we have more of that, then you have more options for people to do, as a consequence, lowering the price. I get that. But think about it this way: who can actually be able to afford having to buy, even if I recognize on their side they might be able to push an economic advantage of it being marginally cheaper? 10, 15, 20%? I think the average person, whether you're a student, you're a Gen Z dude, or you're an older millennial like myself, it's quite difficult even if those things become cheaper. So this debate is about a comparison of competition and why we prefer having more competition with the build to rent model and the government's incentivizing property developers for such. What are the impacts given everything I've mentioned? Number one, you get better maintenance and quality of the property under the build to rent model because, on average, developers are likely to be able to make the quality of build to rent residential developments better because they know that more people over a long year time frame are going to use it, and of course they're concerned about the cost and opportunity cost of like manpower, maintenance, materials. That is opposed to a build to sell model wherein I'm not saying it's shit, I'm just saying that in many instances these developers, especially those in the middle tier, skimp on particular materials and pass off that burden cost of maintenance to that person buying it. Like, hey, bro, here are the payment terms, pre sale, and then when things happen, you have to pay for it. On our comparative, when we skew the portfolio to giving incentives for them to have more developments for build to rent, we actually encourage better kinds of portfolios being made where the maintenance cost isn't going to be on the burden of those people. Because a lot of these people, especially in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, also experience pay cuts and even being laid off, which can lead to a harm of like ghost cities and a lot of these projects being used as collateral for rents to be able to pay for that thing in the first place. The second is that we simply give people more options and flexibility and don't force their hand. Because, like I mentioned, you can be from like a tier 1 city, but you work in a tier 2 city. Or you're from a tier 2 city, but you live in another tier 2 city, or even are from a tier 1 city. In this debate, if you force the model of the portfolio to skew towards build to sell, you make it significantly harder for them to have a plurality of options and send this message of redundancy like, yo, you gotta buy where you go. You gotta buy in tier 1. You gotta buy in tier 2. We're incentivizing you to do that, which can lead to people being stuck in debt and even not being able to pay for that dream home they worked so hard to be able to finance. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to open this debate and stand on side proposition.
Thanking the Prime Minister for the fine speech, inviting the leader of opposition. Here.
I'll just take 30. Assuming I'm audible.
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. Just give me 30.
Hello.
Hi, yes, sorry. Am I still audible?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in she, her, pronounce she, her, Zoha, POIs by the raise of hands only. Please don't put it in the chat. I won't be able to see that. Or verbalize, please don't verbalize.
Sorry,
Uh,
how do we raise hand here in Discord? Like, I do not. Is there an option?
there should be.
That
If
might
not,
be
just
Zoom.
it's okay.
Sorry, what?
Starting in
Voice or chat? Sorry, what's better? What's preferred? Sorry.
just say POI. It's okay.
Okay.
Starting in 3, 2, one, I think we first need to understand what these tier one cities actually look like. The idea is that there are a lot of migrant workers who come from tier two or even rural areas for that matter to work in these tier one and tier two cities at all points in time. This is extremely important because this also changes the way the demograph of these tier one and tier two cities look like in the first place. This means that there's a lot of influx or lower income class population entering into the demograph in the first place. As a whole, India as a country as a whole has a lot of divide in this demograph, which means there's only like 35% of population is actually above poverty line or like more on the higher income spectrum than the rest of the like 55 to 60% of the population that still is like very very poor and does not have a lot of housing or a lot of like money in a way to sustain themselves at all points in time. This demograph is extremely important, especially in tier 1 cities where the problem is not that there is no availability of houses, but the problem comes from affordability. There is no money for these people to go ahead and rent or to go ahead and own or live in these housing states, so to speak, right? Then the problem becomes that whatever you are going to go ahead and incentivize as your model on site government is not going to work out because there's going to be a lot of misdirection of funds, and there's going to be because the money in and of itself of a country like India is very concentrated and very less in the first place. I think what the next model here that can be set up here is how these government can probably create housing schemes that allow people from these lower income strata to go ahead and have housing benefits at all points in times. This probably looks like using these existing available resources that they have to create or to probably give them like housing, to give them little to no interest on housing, on rents, etc., or to buy these houses, etc., to give them long-term loans which have like which don't have like a compounding interest onto them, or to give them like low cost values in the first place so that they can probably opt into these ideas or opt into this housing scheme in the first place. What does this do? I think this firstly guarantees that they have secure housing, because a large demograph of these tier 1 cities are going to be people who are lower middle class to lower income classes in the first place, right? Which means that they probably are working like very miles away from their home. They want to probably earn a living for themselves, and on top of that you want to like pressurize them into renting homes which are probably way out of their
POI.
pockets, and so on and so forth. This means that the idea of securing housing, the idea of security in terms of where they live and the home ownership, etc., only comes from the fact that you have these government subsidies in place and you have these government schemes in place that allow these people from the lower income classes to have houses in the first place. The problem of security comes from many positionalities. The first being obviously that they are probably they probably don't have the money in the first place to go ahead and opt into these houses in the first place. But the idea is also how you want to you have these government incentives that are redirecting them,
POI.
creating. Sure.
If these people are as disenfranchised or struggling as you say, then renting would be a better option for them as opposed to incentivizing them to have to buy, even if on your side it might marginally be cheaper.
I think this also connects to the idea of how ownership of a house guarantees security. If you would just let me finish that point, right? The idea is for a lot of people to rent houses, especially in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, is how caste system also is very functional, even if people deny it in India in and of itself. This also means that they do not have that security in renting a place in India, insofar as there's also a higher caste person living in the same communities, living in the same building, etc. Which means after a certain point in time, they're probably going to go ahead and kick them out of the house after a few months or 11 months and so on and so forth, because they are from a lower caste and they don't want to engage with people who are from these lower castes at all points in time. This is an inherent problem within the Indian context at all points in time, and which is very, very crucial or also very, very important in like these tier 1 and tier 2 cities at all points in time. You cannot just say that, oh, the caste system does not exist, because it does, and people are getting thrown out of their houses for the same reason, right? When there is a government body that is allowing these people to probably have the secure housing in the first place, you are giving them more chance to go ahead and have this sort of security and sort of housing needs that they require at this point, right? So the idea then comes from the fact that, oh, these lower caste people and those lower class people, lower income people are being exploited marginally by these build to rent housing schemes, etc., because the landlords are probably those who are very, very rich, who have a lot of capital, who are probably going to raise rents, etc., etc., towards these lower class people at all points in time. This means that they won't always have that sort of money at their disposal to give to these landlords, etc., etc. But then secondarily, how these are then going to go ahead and exploit these people in the longer run, because they are from, let's say, a different background, different social positioning, etc. This is also inherent to this idea of how there is a division of people within tier 1 and tier 2 cities, but all over India in general, right? But the idea is that when in a tier 1 city you are working as like a clerk or a peon in a school or whatever, but as compared to like a rich person who is also working a corporate job, there's only going to be like so much variations in terms of where this is going to be targeted, right? So the idea is the people that are going to probably target the people that are going to be targeted through these build to rent schemes are always only going to be those people who probably can afford that, which means it's only going to ever talk to or be targeted towards people who are upper middle class or of the upper class, who work in proper corporate jobs, who have that money to cough up and pay for the rent in the first place. The lower income people are always going to be marginalized through this scheme at all points in time, because of the fact that even if they make a large majority, or even if they make a large majority of population, the idea is they don't make enough profits for these build to rent schemes, etc., to go ahead and opt into in the first place, which means the target audience for these build to rent schemes is always going to be people from the upper class and the upper and on the higher end, because they can maximize profits out of them. This is all like a capitalist structure, right? And we are also already living in a capitalist structure, right? So these lower income people have virtually no capacity to go ahead and be or opt into the build to rent schemes at all points in time. Then what do we tell you? We tell you that there is also the idea of caste and class discrimination that exists at all points in time, where a lot of lower income people don't really have the capacity to access all of these resources, and for all those reasons, I'm proud.
Thanking Elo for the fine speech, inviting DPM. Here.
Okay. POS through voice. Wait a second. My timer. Starting my speech in the next word. In a country where owning a home is the ultimate dream, we forget that millions are still chasing a place that they can simply afford to live. Because in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities in India, there are places where job opportunities are scattered and more people are migrating in these areas in the first place. What's happening in the status quo and what opposition fails to recognize is that the majority of rental properties in India's major and emerging cities are currently controlled by fragmented and small private owners. That's literally the reason why they're right when they talked about why sometimes you have rental inflation. Sometimes there's instances where people just suddenly increase rent. But I don't think they understand the policy coming from Josef. The opposition concedes that the cities are overflowing with migrant populations, yet completely misdiagnoses what that means for housing policy. Their comparative is just expand subsidies or public housing benefits, which is still unrealistic because it ignores the fiscal and structural reality that governments cannot simply lower housing the cost by that degree. It's not going to be realistic that we will have an affordable amount of quality even if that is done. It's just going to be as in terms of magnitude. So land scarcity, high construction input prices, and private ownership patterns in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities make large-scale subsidized housing economically unsustainable. That's why their side of counter proposition is just simply failing. Even when state attempts it, the result is bureaucratic bottlenecks and poor quality units and spatial segregation at the urban periphery that were going to happen in this cities in India. And this is precisely where Joseph's framing becomes decisive. The state must collaboratively with private housing institution expand the rental stock, not compete against them. And this is the policy coming from Joseph. We want to incentivize a lot of private housing institution to build to rent in order for us to have a thriving competition, a larger volume of rentals that naturally breeds market competition, driving affordability through structural supply rather than artificial control. Moreover, the build to rent model offers developers a realistic and sustainable ROI. It aligns private profit with public welfare because this creates a self reinforcing incentive for both state and the market actors to deliver high quality and accessible housing. So this proves in the framing that the actors within this debate have the incentive to do this right because Op is right. We live in a capitalist structure. That's why you want to realistically probe how actors will revolve around this. How are they going to do this well realistically based on their condition and based on the limitations that they have? So therefore, these units that you have currently in status quo are poorly constructed and consistently maintained and overpriced precisely because there's no large-scale institutional competition to regulate rent levels or quality. In effect, when we incentivize a lot of private housing institution or a lot of other housing institution in the status quo with our policy, it's not just going to be, we have more rentals, therefore we have better quality of market competition. It's not just that. It's just that we will also have a larger units that will outscale all of the private rentals that you have right now. Because a build to rent model interrupts the destructive cycle by providing affordable, professionally managed rentals that match urban reality in India instead of just clinging to the outdated dream of ownership at any cost. Because in both sides of the house, people can buy and rent properties, right? But the truth is, this balance is collapsing and opposition is blind to it. For decades, India's obsession over building to sell, flooding the market with units meant for ownership while starving cities of real livable rental option. The result is an urban housing that no longer serves the people, it leads them. And here's the important factor that panelists needs to take note. The brutal reality is that most new quote unquote for sale properties aren't being bought by families. They're hoarded by a lot of rich people. They flipped into an overpriced rentals that trap middle and lower income tenants into the cycles of debt and precarity in tier 1 and tier 2 cities, which Op correctly points out in their context. But they have a mismatched solution here. Because the problem with this, okay, I'll take the POI.
Why will this housing be affordable and accessible to people from the lower income classes?
We already explained to you that we have more competition and we have the corporate incentive since these are literally private housing companies that will thrive against each other because we incentivize them to build more in order for them to rent. Therefore, we will dictate the pricing of rentals based on the market stock rather than, having private entity owners in your side of the house that will dictate these prices at the end of the day. And you never fix this problem. You don't have any solvency. Your solvency is just to simply avoid it, to simply build more houses and to simply create more incentive in order for these people to opt in and get more houses, which is not just unrealistic but also dismisses the problem that we have right now because a lot of people will still be displaced in this area, especially when they still can't afford a lot of housing due to the quality of help that you can provide for them. So we are now watching an economy where renting is either a luxury or a punishment, where millions of workers in tier 1 and tier 2 cities spend half of their income just to stay near their jobs in apartments that are either unaffordable or inhabitable because of the lack of competition and the lack of state intervention here. This crisis then emerges from a structural vacuum of institutional competition that will persist to happen in all. A market structure that has, for decades, privileged speculative ownership while systematically disincentivizing the development of large-scale, professionally managed rental ecosystem. In the absence of the policy coming from Joseph, we won't be capable of competing on price, quality, and tenant experience. The rental landscape will never be democratized inside opposition. We comparatively solve this in our side because we re-engineer the housing market's incentive structure rather than merely adding supply into the broken framework. So what we do is that by catalyzing institutional build to rent, RETs, pension funds, and large-scale developers whose revenue model is predicated on sustained occupancy rather than speculative chum, we reconstitute housing as a competitive service economy anchored in permanence, quality, and efficiency due to market competition incentive. This structurally disciplines rent inflation, which is an exclusive benefit that you can never feel in all because they never form to have a stimulus for these areas, and you never have a solvency in this specific problem. We embed tenant protection and we double it down because the state possesses strong incentives to implement this policy effectively because stable housing and improved livability in these areas or urban clusters directly translate into a more anchored workforce and higher productivity for their economy at the end of the day. So in all of that, and at the end of the day, you have more ROIs and you have more stagnating economy in our side of the house.
Thanking DPM for the fine speech, inviting DLO. Here.
I'm assuming I'm audible. Uh, the way, like, I would prefer if the POIs are verbalized, but like, don't ask constantly. If you've asked once, that's good enough because the volume on Discord is very weird. So just verbalize once. I don't think there's any chat which I can see simultaneously while being on the screen. But yeah, that's about it. I try to ask for it myself. But that being said, I am audible, right? Because there's no response to any of this.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yatharth Surana is deputy. Starting in three. 1 second. 3, 2, 1. There's a fundamental problem in terms of the explanation they give with regards to the housing crisis in India. They say that housing crisis exists in India because those people can't afford. If you go ahead and create more build to rental spaces, which means there are more spaces, and competition is an incentive which will make these cheaper and people will buy it. This is just absolutely untrue because that is not how the housing market of India works. There are several things which I'll take up from their case to explain why they are false. One is the builders who are working lobby together. That looks like builders like Lodha, which they talked about, or other builders like James or whatever that is. They have a lobby together because the incentive of these builders is very similar. They want to earn as much profit as possible from these housing buildings which they go ahead and make, which means they're okay with not allowing a lot of people to enter into this market. Therefore, the number of builders are limited. That means no new player can easily enter and try to build this model and then give it out. So this means the model with the creators will be the ones who have been working in India for a while, which means their incentive stays the same, which is to earn as much profit as possible. Secondly, the population in India is vast. There's always someone who can pay more than the other person to get this housing, which means if at a point in time you create this build to rent model, if you go ahead and say that, oh, the renting starts from let's say 20,000, but if someone else goes and offers you 30K, you know that the market is capable of paying that. You don't care about giving housing to affordable people because you want to just give it away. I'm sorry, what? Uh,
Shivani, could you please mute? Great. Yatharth, I have you at 1 minute and 24 seconds.
Fair
So,
enough. The last word you heard was about.
so the last thing that I wrote down is on. So I think you completed the idea of lobbying and then you started the second idea.
Okay, fair. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The second area then becomes is the way you engage with these people. So if you know that there's a population which can pay you 40,000 for a house you can earn like house you were initially going to sell for 20,000, you'll increase the price and make it 40,000 because you want to earn as much profit as possible. And this goes a long way because every housing area has this population which can come up, especially in urban areas wherein cities are expanding. People want to go ahead and get housing and start to have long-term rentals in areas which might develop later. So even if you go to an outskirt, this still stays the same because because you can earn more profit, you're going to go ahead and engage in as much cost as possible. But then the first idea, which Zuha has already explained, what is the structural issue which India has, and how is our model able to, our counterprop able to solve this much more? Because the problem here is about affordability. India does not suffer from like lack of built housing units. There are a lot of housing units. It's like these housing units are not accessible to people from the lower classes for several reasons. First is that because they just cannot afford that in these areas because they don't have income enough, for which they need subsidies from the government. They need support from this government because they're able to do this. Why are we able to specifically solve this? Because one, in a country like India, wherein funds are already limited, if you direct them to incentivizing these build to rent models by giving tax cuts or like giving subsidies to these builders, which means you're giving money to rich people who probably are going to earn more profit out of this and never going to give this away to like people who probably really need it. Which means on our comparative, what you simply can do is give this up in form of subsidies, in form of Pradhan Mantri Yojana, like Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, etc. Which means you give free housing when you're like, oh, if you want to just stay for rent, you can just stay here. You need proof of rent and you need proof of housing and proof of work because why you're staying here, and you can just stay in these models. Sure, this takes a comparatively bigger load on this government, but that's exactly what this money is for. You need to spend it on welfare and not to fund rich people's pocket at any point in time. But secondly, the second reason here is the way housing works in India. Because understand, people will try to go ahead and have community housing. So if I am living in one area, I will prefer to live in an area wherein people from my community or my religion are there. I don't want people from other castes or other communities to live in the same region. This goes wrong way because this exists even in upper classes and exists a lot more for lower classes. Because you see how gated colonies are becoming a bigger norm in India, which means all these built to rent models will be most likely a gated colony or a high rise building, which is a singular building because you will be having apartments. Which means that if you want to get more profit, you will likely have people from the urban and the elite classes who can afford this. This means you actively cut out people from the lower strata who cannot afford it, because even if they have the money, they can't. At all points in time, they will always be locked out of the system because people don't want them here. But even if by some way or some change in the policy, you say, oh, we will definitively give this to them. There's a lot of red tapeism which exists in terms of renting models. Because understand, India does not have very strong rental ecosystem. Like, there is no strong tenancy protection law in India as of now. The Act in 2021 barely gets implemented because of the legal issues which survive it, because it's still in court till this day. Like most of India's rental housing stays in informal sector. They can't now switch their policy now and go and say that, oh, anyone can go ahead and really do this. Why is BTR going to specifically fail here? Because like build to rent model depends on like stable rental regulation. You have clarity in terms of how much rent you can cap, how much eviction you can have, how much maintenance will you be giving, how will you resolve disputes, etc. In India, these institutions are weak and codes are slow. So either these developers price this with risk with higher rents, because that's exactly what they're going to do, because they know that the law is weird, we can earn more profit, and we want to risk avert. So we don't want tenants to stay there for longer. So you want to make exploitative contract which hurts tenants again. You hurt them by exploitative contracts, but with higher rents, so they can't really do. Because understand, the social effect of this is very simple. Because fewer renter tenants exist, large BTR landlords can easily impose arbitrary rent and rent hikes. Then they can evict tenants because they're like, oh, we want to maintain a higher turnover, we'll just remove you if we wish. Like, I'll take that POI.
On both sides, people can rent and buy because you have cheap, mid, and expensive options. On your side, how will that guy get out of that bad contract with the landlord? On our side, he can find another landlord because there's more to rent from.
Issue in India is not having rental. There are several people who are trying to rent. The competitors, individual rentals will still exist. So if someone is buying that house, they can still rent it out individually. I'm not having an issue with that. When you give this power to an institutional level which centralizes this means the problem exists on several levels, because there's one person who can hold out everything. He controls the monopoly of the whole building. That is exactly the problem is, and the number of people who control this in terms of the overall economy are very low. Individually doing this democratizes it. But what we are saying is, instead of using this money to incentivize, you use this money to subsidize housing, to give out free housing to people from lower strata where they can actually live and sustain themselves. You understand, India's regulatory environment encourages corruption because land acquisition zoning is extremely clear. Urban land in tier 1 cities is very scarce, fragmented, and is most likely entangled in legal disputes. When you incentivize like this build to rent, you go ahead and embrace elite capture. Politically connected developers acquire this public land under rental housing schemes, and then they use it to rent it to hire people. I think we've seen this pattern several times because similar thing happens when any time a slum development reproject came in, or a SEZ came in, or Vantara, any of these private firms got cheap land, or because of these relaxations, and then sold unit at market rates, because you are giving money, you are giving incentive or tax cuts to these people, assuming that they will pass it on, but they have no incentive to pass it on because they can earn more money, especially because the relativism encourages. But understand, the cultural and economic mismatch of this is higher, because home ownership is not just an asset, it's a sign of social legitimacy. By doing this, you go ahead and say that, oh, only the higher classes can own homes because they can afford it, other people have to actively go into this rent models, because there is no way you can buy houses in this rental model. For those reasons, extremely proud.
Thanking DLO for the fine speech, inviting government whip. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yep,
Hello?
both.
Thank you. Take a PY's voice. It was. Three, two, one, and go. Opposition bench gives a solution without any mechanisms to make that solution viable to the people they want it to affect. Because if the only thing that they want to do is enable lower class people to buy land and property, then these people will buy that land and property, find out how expensive developing and managing that land actually is, take out loans to maintain that upkeep, eventually lose that land, and now be trapped in debt with little to no alternative. It's obviously and completely unresponsive to the case both of my partners forwarded in this round. They point out a problem of not having the lower class be able to live in these cities, yet they offer no solution in giving these people homes. We do give and provide that alternative, so we probably have to win this round. Two clashes in my speech. One, on where people within India's tier 1 and tier 2 cities better off. Two, on the management of these properties and how and who actually has a more sustainable model for short and long-term progress. I'm going to talk about the first clash on the interests of the people living within these places. The first thing I want to do is highlight and weigh Joseph and Matthew's extensive characterizations of the likely behavior of how the build to rent housing model works in comparison to the likely comparative of build to sell, which opposition bench just completely ignored and failed in defending. The first thing I want to discuss is the difference in incentive for these housing models. Joseph was very clear. India's tier 1 and tier 2 cities are likely to have lots of pockets that have nascent and underdeveloped infrastructure and are places where a lot of people want to work. The reason for this importance is because the average middle class individual incentivized to work in these areas need a lot of flexibility to be more assured of these long-term commitments on whether or not they actually want to buy a house. Committing to managing a property is a humongous risk. And insofar as it necessitates a lot of complex management, the average person is likely to be reliant on loans, debt, and external factors going extremely optimistically in their favor, which, as Joseph points out, like right now in the world that we're living in, is probably not going to happen. This is the reality check that I am giving to side opposition, because they just presume people will handle all of these properties well when they are incentivized and made to buy all of these lands without any mechanism or any analysis to prove why that's the case. But secondly, I would posit that this is an even worse harm than the harm DLO points out to us in his speech. Because when people are oppressed by unfair contracts through landlords, we have credible mechanisms in order to combat it. But if you're the owner of that land and you mess it up, now you're in debt. There's very little alternative to actually fix it. That's like comparatively an extremely worse harm that they have to contend with. The first piece of weighing I want to make explicit is on the gravity of impact. That is to say, on our side, the average person has more money because they have less bills to pay in owning these properties. Compare this to the small minority of individuals on op who, on the off chance they can afford property, will not be able to actually manage it because it's hard. This ties back to LO's own framing. Because if the problem is affordability, then they probably can't buy land anyway, so they're more likely to rent anyway. But when you don't have that priority of build to rent, then renting necessarily must be more expensive because you have less options available. But secondly, It also responds to DLO's attempt at actually responding to us. The core thing opposition doesn't understand is that people are incentivized to rent either way because they probably can't afford to buy homes as per their characterization. So operating on this assumption, it's just comparatively better when people and the government shifts its priority to making sure that housing build to rent model becomes good because it allows more checks and balances to be made at the point in which our policies allow for more competitors to enter into that market, something that Matthew pointed out as exclusive on our side. The second thing I want to explain and discuss is just on the matter of scale, right? Because build to rent housing necessarily makes it easier for all of these people that they're talking about to find a job, to live in these places, and in order for them to make a lot more money. When on their comparative of build to sell, that necessarily cuts off millions upon millions of more people. Note that the scale of these impacts, right? On our side, the average Indian has more of an option on where they can live. But secondly, because there are more options available and you have that capitalist incentive to actually choose and pick, renting necessarily has to become lower due to all of Matthew's mechanisms that they didn't listen to. Again, this clarifies and responds to LO's case about making it more affordable. On our side, lower income people have more opportunity to choose where they want to live. So if one landlord is bad, they do have the option to choose somewhere else. You have more option to actually save yourself on our side. The third and final thing I want to talk about is risk management. Literally, it is our side that allows for all of these lower class people that opening opposition talked about in order for them to save more money, to be able to amass wealth while renting first and have that choice be more possible. This is where the nuance to India becomes important because we necessarily have to take the trade off of finding a more base need first rather than actually being able to own a home, right? The latter is far more financially irresponsible for them, and our side, like the former, is just far more within the interest and like actual capacity of these people. I'll take the POI now. Go. Okay, no POI. Second clash, really quickly, on the sustainability of all of these housing models, which is a really important issue that like we got no response from opposition. Joseph and Matthew gave us a really important impact that side opposition just didn't engage with, right? The difference between renting and selling is that renting has a presumption that it will need to house more people. So the core difference is also about how the construction of these houses are likely to be a lot more robust and a lot more stronger in comparison to build to sell. Again, that's the core mechanism that Matthew gave. Insofar as it allows us to have more stable and long lasting infrastructures, because landlords and corporations that exist on our side have every incentive to make sure it doesn't get destroyed. This is just far more important given that in the long term, when these like built to like rent houses are there and are more proximate to people, you just get to house and help a lot more people in comparison to giving all of these people land, which we aren't even sure that they're going to manage properly. Again, there were no mechanisms to actually like support this point. And as a consequence, it will probably lead to them not developing like very good houses well. And as a consequence, all that land will end up inevitably wasted. It's far more better when you have these corporations managing it because they have a net benefit for everyone involved. For all of those reasons, it's very, very clear that it's a gov win. Thank you.
Thanking government whip for the fine speech, inviting opposition whip. Here, here. Matthew, could you please mute yourself? Thank you so much. Top whip. Here you are.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible.
Yep.
Cool. Just give me like 30 seconds. All right, Kashvi going off this. He heard POIs just verbalize after the fourth minute, but just do it once, don't hurry, please. With that, starting in three, two, one. Government has the comparative all wrong. Our comparative is not making like incentivizing building to sell model. It's to incentivize none of them. The comparative is literally to like offer subsidies and low income housing, because this is where the funding is essentially going to go to. And we think it's a pretty fair trade off to take when we say that it's okay if this probably costs like a little more money. The idea is that at least this money is not going into like fueling the pockets of these rich people and of these like corporate landlords at all points in time. And I'll tell you exactly how their case just falls flat, right? I think on their idea, I think they're gravely mistaken when they think that just because you have more variety now and just because you have more houses to rent, this variety is actually accessible to people of the lower income households. The problem here is that even if there's a lot of variety, the demographic of these tier one cities is also extremely, extremely vast, which means that when you have lower income people, you also have a large variety of middle income people and a large variety of upper income people, which means that at no point in time will a corporate landlord be willing to rent their property to someone from a lower income household when, in their words, they care about return on investment. Which means that when you want a return on investment, you essentially want to invest into like tenants who can probably give you that ROI more securely, and people whose income proofs are just something a lot more credible on a comparative to like lower income people. Which means that sure, variety exists. This variety is never ever accessible to these people in the first place, people who probably needed that housing in the first place at all points in time. I think when that is true, their case on like these people will now have options to choose from just does not really happen, because again, you just don't really have access to these options in the first place at no point. We think then on their idea of like how people probably don't want to go ahead and commit to like home ownership because they just don't live in these cities, etc., etc. I think this is something that Yatharth also fleshes out to you towards the end of his speech. The idea is that on Indian values and on the idea of like how India as a country is structured, home ownership is seen as a sign of stability. It's seen as a sign of security, which means that the ultimate goal that most people probably have as a sign of appearing well settled in life is to have a home. The problem is that when you go ahead and actively incentivize build to rent housing models, what you're doing is you're probably disincentivizing building to sell models. When that is true, there's essentially like a mismatch in the availability of houses that you can probably buy. When that is true, the amount of houses that you can probably buy automatically becomes a lot higher. Which means that when the price is a lot more, there's a lot less accessibility for these houses to buy from people who probably belong to the middle classes or lower classes. When that is true, houses that you can probably buy is only accessible now to people belonging to richer classes or people belonging to like upper caste, which means that lower class people or middle class people are never able to access it, which means that they never experience that sense of security, and they're constantly stuck in a perpetual cycle of like having houses only for rent, and they never have this sort of house stability, which means that mentally also they never feel the sense of security that rich people can probably feel based on like house ownership at all points in time. I think their idea of like people not wanting to commit just does not stand at all points in time. They also then talk about how they probably have like credible mechanisms for like keeping checks and balances. I don't understand how that is true, because it's something that never comes up in their past two speeches other than WIP. But on just the idea of like credible mechanism, government is not going to essentially go ahead and place a check and balance mechanism on these landlords at any point, which means that the government only probably cares about incentivizing them to build these models. It's not going to go ahead and check who these houses are going to in the first place, which means that you can probably never ever know who these houses are essentially going to like lead to at any point. I think we do a fair job in proving why these houses will just then never be accessible to people belonging to like lower income at all points. I think weighing then simply on just the idea of like likelihood of access. On their side, lower income people can never truly access this simply on the idea of like how corporate landlords want this return on investment. When that is true, the likelihood of these corporate landlords giving lower income people the houses
You,
just never ever like comes to fruition. I'll take it later, please. Which means that at no point these people have access. I think on our side, there's a counter model which exists, which is something that they never ever actually deal with. On our side, this funding is probably going to go to offering subsidies to these poor people or offering like low income housing to these poor people, which means that accessibility at all points only ever exists on off counterfactual and never ever on like whatever government wants to push to you. I think the simple idea then is that on their side, there's a heavy misdirection of government funds, which means that you can never ever direct funds to things that probably matter a lot, because what your funds are essentially going to is to like how it's like fund these like building to rent models at all points, which means that this probably then leads to a cycle where you're constantly fueling rich people's pockets, who are then again only giving houses to other rich people who they can go ahead and actually invest in, because corporates at all points mostly only care about this idea of like profit maximization. They do not care about public goodwill. But if they're also getting the government's money along with that with no checks and balances, I think it just like fundamentally fundamentally raises the issue even more, where these people just have no security. But then also on the idea of like how caste and cultures interact with it, right? Before that, I'll take you on.
On our side, the proliferation of rental options in itself becomes the low income option, as opposed to on your side where you're contingent on the government like developing that and doing it
Okay.
right.
The issue is it never becomes a low income option because no one is willing to rent it to the people of the lower income household. In your words, if competition exists and if all these and if every such like corporate institutional landlord is essentially going to go ahead and rent houses to these people, it means that they all want to earn more money. Why then is there any incentive for them to go ahead and rent to people in lower income households or people belonging to like lower income strata at any point in time? Is something that is extremely unclear. But then also just the idea of like accessibility, right? Even if we say that they can probably still like buy these houses, the issue is that they have 11-month contracts, after which the landlords probably look for reasons to like make them leave because people around them don't want them living with them. In just the general idea of like how caste system works in India, you probably don't want to like live with people who are a different caste from you. You probably don't want to live with people who are a different religion from you, which means that at no point is harmony in this living system that these people probably want to cater to. But on just that idea, I think these people then have a lot of difficulty also getting their application for renting approved in the first place, which means that they cannot really ever access all of this that they want to. But also on just the idea of like just because government is incentivizing it does not really mean it translates to reaching the people. What it's essentially going to lead to is these corporate landlords hoarding that sort of money and having that sort of unnecessary power over housing and where this housing essentially leads to. This looks like you probably never ever going ahead and getting these houses in the first place because your application probably did not get approved because someone who could probably like promise a better return on investment has their application approved instead of you because of how this model because of how the demographic probably looks like. You have people belonging to a lot of different classes who are all looking for houses in this. With this, very proud to oppose.
Thanking opposition whip for the fine speech, inviting opposition reply. Here.
Great. I'm assuming I'm still audible. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The only claim coming from side government is that, oh, when you incentivize build to rent housing, this means that there are more housing projects which will be there, because of which you will be able to rent out to more people because it's going to be affordable. The only mechanism for this is because you have enough housing and there is competition which will make them go ahead and do this. We tell you that this is exactly what is not going to happen because the competition exists because you want to earn more profits as an individual. But you all know that one limit is there after which you earn profit. You're not going to go beyond like below that limit at any point in time. But what is more likely to happen is something we already flesh out to you, that if you can earn more, if you can earn, let's say, 50,000 or 60,000 by renting this house to one person, you have absolutely no reason to rent it out for 20,000 even if that's beyond your limit. Which means if more profit is available, these landlords are going to go after more profits because that's the reason they work. Which means even the fundamental issue in their model is that government incentivizes these models. So you give tax breaks to these builders, you give subsidies to these builders to go and create these housing, but they never get transferred to the real public. So there's a fundamental issue here because the money which was supposed to go and use for welfare and housing schemes for the country is now going into the pockets of these builders who earn more profit by providing them to people who probably are relatively well off and are probably not the most vulnerable who need this housing the most. On the comparative, what we tell you is fairly simple. We tell you it's better for the government to directly use this to create public housing, to fund it in schemes like Awas Yojana, wherein you can get free rentals, where you can get free housing, where you can sustain this. Why? Because we tell you that even if this is something which takes a bit more money or happens a bit lower in scale, it's still better off because the population actually needs it. The population they're trying to cater to is the one which probably already has housing or probably can afford housing elsewhere, does not need government to incentivize these build to rent models to go and create them. Because I'm unsure why rental is not available at a point in time. Build to rent model does not exist for these upper classes or higher middle classes, which means the demographic they're catering to is already being catered to. They have no how they're made to prove affordability and how this is going to be accessible for other people. We tell you there are several mechanisms because of which these builders don't have the incentive to go and do this. One is because they can lobby together in order to go ahead and do things. This means a new builder cannot just directly come in because there'll be gang lords coming onto them because the lobby exists if and you won't be allowed to enter into this lobby. You don't want competition because of which the number of builders are going to be limited. Therefore, this practice will continue and you can't have an outsider to break this. Second reason we tell you is because you want people of higher classes who can pay more, it's likely that you will not allow people from lower stratas of the economy or lower caste of the economy of the country to enter this space because you want the overall space to be as profitable as possible, as clean as possible, and as high caste as possible because you are also most likely an upper class person who's trying to go and gain money out of this. This means you effectively lock out people from the lower strata to engage in this build to rent housing models because what happens now is not controlled by individuals now because individuals can be liberal at times. They don't have profit incentives of, oh, I want the whole building to know one another. You don't care about every other building. An individual is renting it out or an individual is doing things, that is more likely that you have some ability that a person can probably engage and get this housing. Versus the comparative, this happens in a centralized manner because of which whatever is happening is controlled by the single entity that is a builder, which means you're locking out a big chunk of population who probably needs it. The next thing we tell you is how this is important for the idea of housing in the first place and how this affects it in a bad way. India sees housing as an important thing. That's the final goal of what you want to do. This is something which Gov concedes as well. We tell you that via incentivizing build to rent models, you effectively cut out other kinds of area because the government now actually says that, oh, we are spending money here and this is the way we want people to stay in housing, which means when public housing does not exist to the same level, which is now even more cracked down, this means that people from lower stratas cannot go and engage into this idea of having house or having this idea of stability, which means they're already messed up. They can never be equal of other person. They're always living in this constant shithole of not knowing what is happening because the amount of bureaucracy, amount of the lack of tenancy laws make their lives hell if they're living in a rental system. Regardless, we take you the worst case and the best case. For those reasons, extremely proud.
Thanking opposition reply for the fine speech, inviting government reply. Here.
Hello, am I audible, invisible?
Yep.
Thanks. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, the case line and path to victory of side opposition is all over the place. Let's look at what happened, right? They started off by talking about, oh, these people are poor, they can't afford stuff, minorities, migrants. And I understand that the motion is about us talking about these incentives, but as what we've consistently told you and what I told you in my POI to the previous speaker, these in itself become the option for these low income earners and people. Because I understand, sure, you can incentivize them in like other ways, but we question the exclusivity of that and the risk that it places. Because if those landlords are as perverse as you say, then on our side, like what we've told you have ways to be able to get out of that when you have a plurality of rental options and landlords to choose from. But then they say again, bro, those guys, they're gonna be bad. They're gonna offer it to the highest bidder only. That's why my other POI was important because I talked about there being a range of options. On both sides of this debate, you can buy, you can rent. But these corporations aren't like stupid, right? They have a multitude of options. You have like a mid option, an expensive, a cheaper option. And on our side, you unlock that plurality when there's simply more to choose from. If you read the info slide, you're intuitively going to be able to understand that the comparative that side opposition can defend is that they need to be able to talk about maybe incentivizing it in other places. They don't really talk about the idea of building to sell, but they do this Hail Mary technicality coming from the whip and like some new argumentation also from that and the reply in an attempt to be able to respond to us. They're like, yo, we're not saying like we gotta just defend the build to sell. We can do other stuff like incentivize them in other ways. That's why my POI was also important because I'm like, bro, what are you going to be able to do? Because on our side, we give them more options. On your side, it's conditional to, I don't know, government housing being fine Again, TLDR, our side, when you incentivize these developers to have more options, in and of itself become the option of those people. As an average reasonable judge and person, what's harder? Buying your own thing, being reliant on the government to fix that, or a very clear and simple burden on our side, which was you have a multitude of options to be able to choose from, and that in and of itself makes incentivizing worth it. What are the things we talked to you about that their side did not respond to? Number one, we talked about overall build quality of these rental facilities when you incentivize them to become better, therefore making it easier for them to be able to upkeep it. Because if you backtrack and look at our speeches, we told you that these corporations, yes, they're profit driven, but they also want to be able to make sure they don't get like fucking sued or they don't get canceled. It doesn't become like a ghost city. They have every means, motivation, and capacity to do it right, as opposed to passing that burden off to them, wherein, okay, they try and buy their own thing, which they otherwise can't afford, and you unlock that like debt trap harm that Matthew mechanized. Next, we think that it's on our side because it's a policy motion. The government, meaning the local and national government, are able to do what they have to do, incentivizing these developers and keeping an eye on them to be able to make these things accessible, which ironically also responds to the new idea coming from their side, which is like, yeah, we just want to subsidize them directly or have government funding. Again, this debate is about resource allocation and the strategy of governments in terms of what they're able to do. If you want people to be able to afford the homes, which you agree with coming from the first speaker, you need to be able to do it with our model. It's better, it's safer, it's cheaper. Very proud to stand on side proposition.
Great. Thanking the government reply for the wonderful speech. With that, we come to the end of this debate. Both the teams can like virtually shake hands and then leave the room. Good luck, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Cross.